will actually work with it. From your lens, what's that about? Do you have an idea of why it's, yeah, sort of so mysterious in medical terms?
It's very interesting, isn't it? Because so much of this irritable bowel syndrome is actually SIBO. I think they quote at least 78%. And yet, if you go to your GP, chances are that you might be told you have irritable bowel syndrome. You may be given a diet sheet at most,
Mm.
which might have low FODMAP foods on it, right? But it's not often enough. It's not really enough because SIBO is, as you know, very complex. Um, I don't know if really what the psychology is around that, but kind of accepting irritable bowel syndrome as a diagnosis because it's not really, one does need to go further. I think a lot of people can feel quite fobbed off by that. So in a way, it can be quite an easy, quick band-aid solution. You've got irritable bowel syndrome, try this. But actually, if we were to go one step further and say there's a high chance that there's actually SIBO, a small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and test, then that helps us tailor the treatment a lot better. Because essentially with SIBO, what's happening is, the upper gut, which is supposed to be sterile, is having bacteria in it, typically these coliforms and anaerobes. And it can be a real nightmare because suddenly having that process go on facilitates translocation of all of these bacterial endotoxins from that gut lumen into the portal blood. And so then it's not just that you have irritable bowel symptoms, but suddenly you've got this whole cascade of other symptoms: food allergies, inflammatory disease, maybe autonomic dysfunction, all kinds of other symptoms. Um, so, the way that, Claire, the way that you and I look at digestion is not just irritable bowel syndrome. It's like, does this person have low stomach acid? Do they have poor digestive enzymes? Do they have an overgrowth of bacteria in the upper gut, which is supposed to be sterile? And by breaking it down into those individual components, I think you can be a lot more specific with the treatment.
I agree. And I mean, I remember I got into functional nutrition sort of early part of the noughties, and everything was Candida, everything, and people being on a Candida diet for life. And actually, then it's so fascinating when you start to look at the research of, well, what grows faster, bacteria or fungus? I mean, then we have to start looking at the bacteria that's creating the right environment for this Candida overgrowth. And so people just were never getting to the bottom of Candida because they weren't looking at SIBO. So I think it's fascinating that it's now becoming so much more information. And we have this really big SIBO protocol. I was really lucky to actually, I say, befriend, be colleague, another gastroenterologist who happened to be the protege of the other one I was telling you used to shout at me, who was my parents' neighbour. But this gastroenterologist actually believed in SIBO, and he used to drop in the odd thing that was really helpful to us on our journey of creating the protocol, which was the antibiotics by themselves won't work. You actually need, he used to call it our hippie stuff. People need your hippie stuff first. They need diet, they need supplements. And then if it's really stubborn and stuck in, that's when you need the antibiotics. But then you need to go back to the diet and the antimicrobials because this is really a problem. If you just take antibiotics, they'll be back a few weeks later. So I find it really fascinating that this could potentially be such a crossover between what doctors do and what coaches do. And
Yeah, I mean, like the hippie stuff is, what we know is the migrating motor complex is really
yes,
critical in SIBO relapses.
yes.
So we're supposed to have this wave of muscular activity that pushes bacteria and debris and old food debris through the gut. But if we're stressed, if we're in our, sympathetic fight or flight, for many reasons, our migrating motor complex cannot function. We cannot have that sweeping through clearing mechanism happening. And that's going to cause recurrent SIBO, essentially. That's going to be a
Mm.
huge, huge cause of the SIBO not being treated. It may even be the cause of the SIBO in the first place. So, yeah, this is why we need the hippie stuff, really, because we need
Yeah.
to, address very complex issues.
Very. And one of the connections we always make is also the blood sugars connection because of cholecystokinin assisting with that migrating motor complex, that motility. So this is where I find the world that we're in and the world that you're in actually so much more interesting than this very segmented medical mainstream view of, well, it's just gut. No, no, we have to talk diet, not just because of what's going into the gut, but also because the effect on things like blood sugars and how that could support or diminish the effect of what you're trying to do. It's fascinating. So,
And actually, Claire,
I'm
if you don't mind me
interested. Go
just
on. No,
adding
no,
on that
please.
point, I was going to
Please.
say, the other thing about SIBO is its relationship to invisible illness. Because invisible
Yes.
illness, which is not really invisible, right? But kind of, again, hasn't been dug into deeply enough and has been kind of dismissed or, uh, yeah, basically dismissed under all of these categories that you and I are talking about. But this link between SIBO and fibromyalgia is
Yes.
astounding. One study found 100% of the fibro patients that they looked at, and just in that study, but 100% of the fibromyalgia patients that they looked at had SIBO. It's also huge in things like interstitial cystitis, which is an absolute living nightmare for anyone that has that.
Ah, that's
It
such
is
a
a
great
big
point,
deal.
making a note, interstitial cystitis, because that is an absolute nightmare, isn't it?
It is. Yeah.
Fascinating. And then I think because I'm just suddenly making some connections, because you're right about the chronic illness, and I'm just pulling together a thread in my brain, which is I don't know if you know the work of Dr. Sophia Clemens. She's a
Hmm.
hung yeah, you do. So for students that we reference her quite a lot, the Hungarian doctor who is pioneering work with I suppose what you would kind of call the cancers that come out of nowhere. So not the hormonal cancers or the direct cause cancers like smoking and lung disease. It would be your glioblastomas where you just kind of go, okay, where the hell did that come from? And she's made the irrefutable connection between intestinal permeability and gut inflammation. And so then, yes, this extra addition of this SIBO, the endotoxins, the causing of the inflammation. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done as well with endometriosis and SIBO. We see such a correlation in testing with endometriosis and SIBO. So I just think it's so exciting. But one of the things and so then fascinating that it's just medically kind of ignored. And I know that one of the things we've struggled with is that the antibiotics, a combination of neomycin, metronidazole, rifaximin, often used by people who really understand. I've heard that metronidazole is not so great when people have got a sensitive gut, which is, a bit counterproductive. But we have an issue being able to get rifaximin for people that have had a SIBO breath test. And what we teach our coaches is to go through the process, do the functional testing, and then refer on. And this is one of the reasons that we, partner with your team because we need somewhere to send people because it's non-medical prescribers can't prescribe it because it's off license. It is, and GPs don't usually believe in it. It's also very expensive. So this is one of the issues that we have is this thing that is quite magic for SIBO, hard to find. From your perspective, other than the money, do you see why it's so hard to tap into?
Yeah, I just think it comes back to the fact that people are being handed out these diagnoses of irritable bowel syndrome, and they're not really investing. The system is not investing the time and resources to test, to diagnose SIBO or to go deeper, and then to prescribe what's necessary. And of course, as you say, you don't just want to give someone rifaximin or metronidazole. You need to follow them up. You need to do a lot of other stuff
Yeah.
around that. And of course, it is a bit of trying. I mean, rifaximin can be brilliant, I'm sure, as you've seen. Sometimes you have patients where, you try rifaximin and metronidazole, perhaps they have aerobes and you have to try ciprofloxacin or you have to try something else. So there is some complexity going on. And I just kind of think that the mainstream system hasn't, up until now, before the AI, revolution, has not been able to deal with complexity quite simply. So let's see what happens in the future. But I think the responsibility is being handed
Mm.
to individuals to invest in their health and to dig deeper um, for dysfunctions and imbalances before they lead to disease. I think that's where I see it at the moment.
I agree. So I was also told that the antibiotics really aren't appropriate for everyone. So if there's someone who's especially frail or who has had gut surgery, they're just not going to work. So this is where, as coaches, I think what I see from our students is this desire to dive deeply into everything and understand everything. And so one of the things that we're always trying to bring them up to, back to is remember your scope of practice. Remember where your knowledge is supposed to end and someone else's is supposed to take over, because you're now talking from such a medical lens. I mean, it's super exciting, but this is where it's the refer on team, refer on, because, and actually, our job as the coach is to guide that client to the referral process and actually say to them, there is hope. SIBO breath test, great. Now I'm going to pass you on. Let's do the diet and then let's pass you on. So I just want to ask you, you just said some really interesting things, and the current NIC regulations state that a full differential diagnosis has to be undertaken before something like rifaximin is offered. So that would then mean you're not checking for no gut obstructions, you're making sure it's not cancer. I think where a lot of people get confused is, but you've got a SIBO positive breath test. So how do you handle that sort of not being in the mainstream medical? Is that just a case of, well, all of your symptoms indicate SIBO, so we're just going to do that? What happens there?
Oh, interesting. I mean, we always have a pyramid of importance, like a triage system, I think, as doctors in our heads, which is that as soon as you eyeball someone, you're excluding all the big red flags.
Mm.
So, I mean, on the first, the very initial workup would be in terms of the history taking and in terms of those first blood tests you do, you're going to be excluding things like cancer. Now, things can coexist, right? You can have SIBO and you can have another problem.
Yes.
So it's about the pyramid of importance, and it's always about, of course, treating the most important thing first. Um, but what you're saying is, what exactly do you think the problem is? What do you think practitioners are struggling with at the moment, in terms of?
I think that I think we get to see a lot of people who are really poorly and that they have gone through their GPs and not had any success with anything. And then suddenly we come along and say, okay, let's do some tests for SIBO. And I think that then there can be okay, well, great. From our perspective, it's like, great, we need to get that SIBO sorted. Let's go on some protocols. Let's, get you. But then when you start reading, especially for things like non-medical prescribers, well, no, there has to be this full differential diagnosis, or usually your GP wouldn't even offer the rifaximin. You would have ended up going to see a gastroenterologist and hope that they believe in SIBO if you end up in that system without being turned away. And so then people are having, all sorts of scopes and shifties and tests and all sorts that, whereas you and I both know, yes, of course, if it's cancer, that's the biggest thing to clear. But where do you, I think the fear from a coach would be, how do I just trust this bit of the process?
Hmm. Look, I think it's great to work with, functional medicine doctor colleagues. I think it is great. And we also refer, right? I refer
Mhm.
to coaches, I refer to nutritionists for in-depth plans for different things. I think, we
Mm.
can't do everything ourselves. And so I
Mhm.
think there's one thing about, a good enough workup to exclude, let's call them the red flags. Once that's happened, there has to be this, when you're aware of all the functional medicine and what's likely and what's really going on for this person, then all of that becomes so valid and so important and at the forefront. So I think there's no simple answer to what you're saying,
Mm.
except for the fact that, yeah, having good colleagues around and having
Mm.
that part where you feel, yep, we've excluded all the worrying things and now we've found the SIBO. Um, that's justification then to really address that, and that is going to make a difference to that person's life.
Okay, final question on SIBO, because I could talk about it all day, but we have to move on because we've got many fabulous topics. But my final question, I remember Dr. Sophia Clemens saying that she didn't necessarily believe that you could ever truly fix intestinal permeability. It would be a case of management. And I think you can learn to manage it well and get some good gut resilience. But my question around SIBO is, Do you think it's ever truly controllable if you change your hormones, if you change your gut environment, or is it just always going to kind of be there ready to come back? Because I think a lot of clients are quite scared it could easily come back.
Yeah, I think so to answer the first part about intestinal permeability and managing it, the body has intestinal permeability for a reason, right? There are
Mm,
times in our life we want our gut to be permeable. In fact, when we're in acute stress, we want our gut to be permeable so that nutrients can get into the bloodstream quickly. During
mm,
pregnancy, we want a certain degree of intestinal permeability. So it's there because it's like a door. It's a useful thing. So it's not really something to ever get rid of. It's not, that makes it sound bad. And this binary approach of good and bad, black and white, illness and health is the old paradigm. And I think what we're doing in functional medicine is we're saying, look, everything's on a spectrum. It's when things are inappropriate for the situation. They're no longer responsive. They're just completely out of keeping
mm,
with what's appropriate. So with intestinal permeability, the problems are happening when you've got this prolonged intestinal permeability, perhaps chronic stress, for example, where you're now ending up with these bacterial endotoxins going into the bloodstream and causing a whole host of other sort of immune dysfunction. So in that sense, I would agree with her that it's something to manage, but
mm,
even I would try to be a bit more positive and say, the body is
mm.
brilliant and naturally very intelligent, and it's just that we want the body's responses to be appropriate, or we want, yeah, to be in keeping with our lifestyles. So that's what I say about managing. Then the second part about whether or not you can ever get rid of SIBO, I really believe you can get to a point in your life where you are really happy with your digestion, and probably
Mm.
you'll have such body awareness though that you will know that if that glass of wine, or if that, whatever is in front of you, you're going to have it, and then there may be consequences. So in that sense, do you call that being rid of SIBO? You make the choice then. Maybe you just
Yes,
have something,
yes,
then you feel a bit bloated that night, you have some SIBO symptoms, and then you also know what to do to get out of it, or you don't have it,
yes.
you feel good. So that's it then becomes a choice. Um, but I definitely believe, I mean, I really, this is what we see all the time. It is possible to actually live with very, very happy digestion, with living without feeling bloated, living without actually having wind, living without having, heartburn or any of these kinds of symptoms. It absolutely is possible. That really should be what people are aiming for.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Oh, I love that. Thank you. So brilliant. And I think as you were just speaking then, I suddenly think I saw intestinal permeability as almost part of a hormonal syndrome. So we talk about hormonal dysregulation, and actually it's almost like hormonal dysregulation syndrome, where we start talking about, okay, yes, there's this issue in the digestion that could not be SIBO. There's the hormonal issues, there's the stress, there's the inflammation, and a bit like metabolic syndrome, there's all these things that make up this syndrome. And individually, not really a problem. Bit of high blood pressure on its own with no other metrics, okay. Bit of high cholesterol on its own, okay. Actually, it's when you put it all together that now we're looking at a picture of ill health, and that's the bits. But individually, on their own, those issues probably not a problem. And as you say, in some cases, really quite helpful. So it's about looking at all of these symptoms as a picture rather than, like you say, the binary perspective of good, bad, I'm healed, I'm not healed.
And I think it's about staying curious rather than, being too perfectionist about it. And I think when we've been ill, we've been on a health journey, and then we recover, that can be such a joy. And then we almost get scared about getting ill again. But realistically, we're a bit like walking coral reefs. We have most of our DNA is not ours, it's bacterial. And we're going around like these walking coral reefs. And sometimes if we go traveling, for example, we might, with the best will in the world, eat everything that we think is good, and then have digestive issues, and we'll think, oh well, what did we do wrong? And it's impossible. We didn't do anything wrong, but the bacteria that we've been exposed to is different from what we would find in the same food substance at home, and so then we've had a reaction, and that's I think it's just about being curious and having the body awareness, and saying, okay, oh, what's happening here.
Hmm.
That's how I would look at it.
I love that. It's a great way of looking at it.